Hi there, my name is Jack Knipe and I am an assistant professor of English and Spanish at Limestone University. Now, in my current context, I'm teaching Spanish and English at a predominantly black institution, or a PBI. That means that about 50% of our students are African American and about 10% are international. A lot of my students speak English as a second or even a third language, and a lot of my students are heritage speakers of Spanish. So, our institution also provides accommodations and accessible education services through the Office of Equity and Inclusion. We also have a lot of students enrolled in our LEAP program, which is a program that offers additional support for students with learning and attention challenges. So, as you can imagine, all of my students bring something different to the table. And in a student centered environment or a student centered approach, I need to do everything I can to create an environment with rich experiences and lots of different types of activities. So every pedagogical decision, whether it be teaching, curriculum, assessment, is intentionally responsive to the students in my classes. So now that we have that as our context, let me go ahead and read the first question. Question number 1, what are some ways that you utilize multiliteracies pedagogy with diverse learners? I'll never forget working on my curriculum map as part of an assignment for one of my Master of Education program courses. It was an MED, an integrated curriculum and instruction, and we had to track every class that we taught using an Excel spreadsheet. So over the course of an academic year, the assignment was to record what we were actually doing month by month, not what we should be doing. So then we went back the following year and we had to update it by fixing things that we had learned. And we had to record content, skills, and assessment month by month and address how we were accommodating diverse learners in each category. Now, I thought mine was pretty solid because I had a good curriculum coach at my school. But when I turned it in, my professor looked at it and said, "Jack, look at your assessments. What are you doing wrong?" I was so confused. I thought things looked pretty good. But then he asked, do you think that tests and quizzes, constant tests and quizzes, are the best way to assess the progress of all of your language students? And after some discussion, it was like a light bulb went off. Obviously, I made lots of changes throughout that following year, and I'm still constantly working to improve how I design, teach, and assess my students or assess my lessons. So now that I'm teaching in higher education, the situation is no different. As I mentioned, my students are diverse. So in my Spanish classes, I have students who are speakers of African American language, sometimes called African American Vernacular English, which is a different discussion for a different day. But I also have heritage speakers of Spanish and even speakers of other languages. For example, I've had students from Spain, Mexico, Puerto Rico, as well as Zimbabwe, Haiti, Poland, Wales, France, and Germany. They all bring diverse experiences to the classroom, but as many of them speak more than one language, we often discuss their experiences, such as what was it like the first time you visited the United States and heard English all day, every day? Or what exposure did you have to English before you came to the United States? Now, responses vary, but using those experiences as a frame for what we do in our classroom really helps. So not only in terms of linguistic transfer, but thinking through real-life experiences that affected their learning of English. Michał, for example, a student from Poland, shared how he decided to go to a McDonald's at the airport in Chicago during his layover to South Carolina to study for college. And the cashier spoke to him in African American Vernacular English, and Michał had limited exposure to that language variety. He shared how that event was stressful, but he'll never forget the phrase, "What you want." So he explained to our classmates in the Spanish class that sometimes you just have to focus on the words you know, push through, and then try to use some of the new language and phrases and patterns that you hear. So we use that as an opportunity to discuss varieties of English, language attitudes, prestige, register, and even the controversial concept of linguistic blackface. So that led to discussions of variety of Spanish and some overlap and how different varieties are viewed. And we practiced some. For example, the phrase, "Can you speak Spanish?" can be said in many ways depending on where you're from. So in Spain, you might say, ¿Puedes hablar español? In Argentina, un Rio Platense, you might say, ¿Vos podés hablar castellano? And in Puerto Rico, you might say, ¿Tú puedes hablar español? Now, if you've read or heard anything from Calansis, Cope, or Fairclough, or anybody in the New London group, you'll probably notice an overlap of situated practice, critical framing, and even some overt instruction in there. It's sometimes difficult to create authentic language experiences in the traditional sense. My institution's in a remote, rural area, and a lot of our students are student athletes, so creating out-of-class activities can really prove challenging. Trying to navigate student practice and competition schedules is like trying to herd cats, and we've tried to do it. So we do what we can in class. We explore real-life social media accounts of some of my friends who are primarily posting in Spanish. We explore college websites in Spanish, and that requires some digital literacy as well as language knowledge. You might not know specific words for majors or academics or admissions, but you usually know where they appear on college websites, and you have a rough idea where to look. We look at the University of Puerto Rico and Rio Piedras, and our students have to see if they can find their majors and find out what it would be like to study there. Then we look at university websites in Spain and discuss some of the differences between European higher education and higher education in the United States. Some other things we do, we study song lyrics and watch popular Spanish language music videos in class from various countries. We talk about genres of music from country to country in the Spanish-speaking world. We discuss slang and things like that. Now, some years I've incorporated an app called Lyrica, and now I just tell them about it, and some of them end up using it on their own. But it teaches the Spanish language through popular song lyrics. Another activity that I've used is having my students interview some of my Spanish-speaking friends via Zoom, and sometimes even some Spanish-speaking international students that we have on campus who come to class as guests. Now, I have the students prepare interview questions ahead of time and practice. Another activity we do in class is simulations, so buying something at a shop or a restaurant, using some of the vocabulary and grammar that they've learned through explicit instruction. In the past, I've even done a driving test in the parking lot using only Spanish, but that's a comical story for another day. So another activity we do is I incorporate total physical response in storytelling, or TPRS, in my classroom. So I might tell them the story of Caperucita Roja, or Little Red Riding Hood, in Spanish. But we use actual ASL signs for some of the vocabulary. So every time I say the word, they have to do the sign. Or if I do the sign, then in the middle of the story, they have to say the Spanish word. After we do a story they're familiar with, I start incorporating myths and stories from the Spanish-speaking world, including indigenous mythology. So we look at Spanish language posters. We even create our own in class. Over the past couple years, I've done an activity where the students created public service posters related to COVID in Spanish, and we hung them up throughout a few buildings on campus. And of course, we write letters to parents, text messages to friends, college admissions essays, depending on the level of Spanish. And this allows us to address issues of register while giving students ample opportunities to practice in kind of a bubbled real-life setting. This semester, they were each given a city in a Spanish-speaking country, from Peru to Guatemala to Equatorial Guinea, and they had to write weather reports sharing what the weather was like yesterday, using the imperfect, what it's like right now, using the present tense, and what it will be like this week, using the future tense. So we do group activities like the poster, we do overt instruction, individual projects. My classes vary from day to day and lesson to lesson. And over the years, I've been able to reassess which activities work best for which lessons and adjust. So I often just say that teaching is more of an art than it is a science. You're constantly assessing based off your student population and the student dynamic what will work best. So you often have to adjust activities mid-lesson if you notice that something's just not sticking. as I mentioned, I end up with a lot of students who speak various languages in my classes. It happens more often in my English for academic purposes, but I also end up with a lot of multilingual learners in my Spanish classes as well. Now, the majority of my students speak English or African American Vernacular English, but I also get students whose L1 is something else. So now for question number 2. How do you provide support for multilingual learners to scaffold their continued and advanced growth across languages? It's important to note that when you read literature about avoiding deficit thinking and aiming towards a funds of knowledge or funds of identity approach, it's not just pie in the sky thinking, it's practical. Once you focus on what your students do bring to the table rather than what they're missing, you can more easily help students to make connections. So second language acquisition research is at a point where we don't talk about a one-size-fits-all approach. Second language teaching should be eclectic. Not in a throw it against the wall and see what sticks kind of way, but in the sense that you're intentionally selecting activities that will work with your specific student population. Now, often I have a student, or if I have a student, whose linguistic repertoire includes a language other than Spanish or English, I'll ask them to give us a quick lesson. Of course, this is all arranged ahead of time and only if they're comfortable and willing. But I'll have them write a series of sentences on the board. Repetitive, simple sentences that I request. So, I go to the store, you go to the store, she goes to the store, I eat bread, you eat bread, he eats bread, and so on. Now, the rest of us try to recognize patterns, and we see if we can figure out what's going on, and even try to create our own sentences in the student's language. It's a fun and relatable activity, but it also takes students outside of the compartmentalized environment of the Spanish classroom to realize that language is all over our systems with patterns that can be analyzed. This is where reflection and meta-language come in. Giving students ways to talk about language, their own or others, and it makes it easier to process and advance. Because a lot of my students speak AAVE or African American Vernacular English on a daily basis, I sometimes beeline straight to their home language and bypass standard academic English altogether. For example, we discussed how the present tense form of the verb in Spanish can be used to express several concepts in English. So, camino, for example, can mean I walk, I am walking, or I do walk. Now, after some nudging, students will usually ask, well, then how do you know the difference? That leads to reflection on differences between AAVE and standard academic English. In standard academic English, we have I walk, which usually implies regularly or habitually. If we want to express the idea of current movement or action, we usually use the present progressive. I am walking. Well, in AAVE, you can say I walk, I be walking, I do be walking, and a host of other things. This leads to a discussion of the invariable or habitual form of be, emphatic forms, and so much more. Now, not only does this validate and affirm the language used by students in my class, it gives them language to talk about language. So then, when we happen upon other verb forms, in Spanish or otherwise, I'll sometimes ask them to explain what's going on. Raising the consciousness of their L1 makes them more conscious of what's going on in their L2. Now, this would be great for the comparisons goal that you can find in the ACTFL World Readiness Standards. Another thing that I encourage in my class is translanguaging. Though this is more prominent or features more heavily in my English for academic purposes classrooms, I do sometimes incorporate it in my Spanish classrooms as well. So this semester, it's been great having a student from Puerto Rico in my class. She's shared examples of when her variety of Spanish actually conflicts with textbook Spanish. We've discussed everything from borrowed words and code switching to calquing and changing registers depending on the discourse. We've had a lot of lively discussions about all of these things, and it's never a boring day. The learners in my classroom are linguistically and culturally diverse. It's one of the things I've loved about teaching at my current institution. We have students from all walks of life. I have students who have learned Spanish when they were younger or in high school, students who are heritage speakers of Spanish, and students who speak other languages. I also have students with learning differences. And that leads to question number 3. What are some examples of multimodal or multisensory approaches that demonstrate you're accommodating diverse learners? Of course, we get accommodation letters for students who are registered with our accommodations office, but some might not have formal IEPs or a diagnosis at all. And we have students with all kinds of differences. It's important to incorporate lots of different types of activities into the classroom. I try to get creative with using project-based learning, the test-teach-test strategy, and small group discussions and activities. Sometimes we'll play games with vocabulary, where I sticky tack the English vocab words and their Spanish counterparts randomly around the room. The students work in teams and try to match them. It's always a race. Some students might know some of the words. Some might know their cognates in another language, and others are just good guessers. It's always a fun time, and it primes the pump for formal, explicit, or overt instruction of those words. I use a similar game sometimes for grammar lessons. I use a lot of time-tested SLA strategies as well. I've already discussed some of these, but I'll detail them more here. Some of the activities we do include a modified version of TPRS, or Total Physical Response in Storytelling. As with any language instruction technique, this activity has some activists as well as some detractors. It's just one of the tools in my toolbox, and I've really seen great success with it when I use it. It keeps the students active and physically moving during instruction. So for example, in telling the story of Little Red Riding Hood, or Caperucita Roja, I might say, Caperucita Roja caminaba por el bosque. El bosque. Caperucita Roja caminaba por el bosque. Árbol, árbol, bosque. Repiten, bosque, bosque. So I'll do several trees for bosque, or forest, and one tree for árbol, or tree. So after we've done several iterations of this, and of course they get used to this routine, I'll add some more vocabulary. Ella vio un lobo. Lobo, the sign for wolf. Lobo. Caperucita Roja caminaba por el, and I'll pause and wait for the students to repeat bosque. Caperucita Roja caminaba por el y vio un lobo. Y vio un, and I wait for the word. Se escondió en él. Of course, after several iterations of using TPRS, it's routine for students. Sometimes I let students co-create signs rather than teaching them ASL, but they seem to really enjoy learning ASL signs, and it's kind of a 2-for-1 language learning situation. We also play Simón dice, or Simon says in Spanish, at random times throughout the semester. After a while, I accept volunteers to lead as well. Now, apart from TPRS and even Simón dice, we do other things that appeal to diverse learners and incorporate multimodal approaches. I might print off the lyrics to a song in Spanish that deals with a topic from our lesson. In Spanish 101, one of the first songs we focus on is Stand By Me by Prince Royce. Now, Prince Royce is a singer from the Bronx in the United States, in New York City, and he's of Dominican heritage, and he sings a lot in Spanish, in English, as well as Spanglish. Stand By Me is in Spanglish. Some of the words and verses are in Spanish, and some in English. Now, I teach the students about large Spanish-speaking population in cities like New York City and the surrounding areas. We also learn about reggaeton, bachata, and other genres of Latin American music, and even the concepts and the differences between translanguaging, calquing, and code switching. I print the lyrics of the song, and we discuss the grammar and vocab that we're learning and that we can find in the lyrics, and then we discuss the song. After analyzing and dissecting the song, we listen to it, and we watch the music video again, and again, and again. Now, eventually, depending on the group dynamic, I teach them basic bachata steps, and we even do it in class. The next day, I ask them what lyrics they remember, and we reflect on previous class discussions, and we listen to the song again. By then, many of them are singing along, and after some encouragement, some dance along. Again, it all depends on the group. You got to know your audience, right? So we do the same thing with Julieta Vanegas' Me Voy. She's a Mexican singer, and we use the song Me Voy to discuss reflexive verbs and other vocabulary. I've got a repertoire of songs that I update each year, and I'm always worried that some will get dated, but sometimes I'll play old songs from previous years as the students are walking into the classroom, and they usually comment that they like them. So Enrique Iglesias' Bailando has thankfully aged well. It's a favorite of mine, and students seem to still love it. It also allows me to teach various dances from the Spanish-speaking world, from flamenco and tango to salsa, as well as the gerund form of verbs and some vocabulary. So another creative activity we do for vocabulary lessons is creating word art. I'll give all the students sheets of paper, and they can choose some words from the vocabulary list from the unit we're studying to create art. The rule is that they have to show us the meaning of the word using only the word. So they might write alto, spelled A-L-T-O, meaning tall, using very tall, narrow letters. They might write otoño, meaning fall or autumn, having all of the letters look like trees with red, orange, and yellow leaves hanging off the letters, with some on the ground. So this appeals to all students, not just the artistic ones, as it allows them to be creative and use some of that artistic aspect. I allow volunteers to show off their art when they're finished and explain their word art in English. We hang up student samples. Now, I'm aware that all students have different skills, talents, abilities, interests, and personalities. So with most things, the explaining and showcasing examples is done strictly on a volunteer basis. Another thing I do is that I often eat in the cafeteria, but for those who prefer practicing Spanish informally, we jointly choose one day a week, and this year it was Thursdays, to sit together and just speak Spanish. I invite Spanish-speaking students, international students, to join us as well. Now, some weeks it completely flops, and some weeks we might have half a dozen to a dozen students that join us. It's just another opportunity for them to practice speaking. Now, in the back of my mind, I always try to make sure that my students are integrating receptive and productive language skills that they can take, and that can take many forms. I always check for understanding. Don't be afraid of formative assessments. I try to set up lots of opportunities for students to use Spanish and showcase their learning beyond just the tests and quizzes. The key is creating varied opportunities for students to engage with the language physically or kinesthetically, visually, auditorily, and so on. And at the end of every test, I always ask students to respond to what they think has worked for them in that unit, what they didn't like, what they did like, or what they'd like to see more of. I always get great responses that show students reflecting on their own learning, but that also allow me to kind of gauge my own teaching and adjust as necessary.